Something in the atmosphere feels like it's shifting, not loudly, not chaotically, but with the kind of pressure that builds behind the eyes before a storm breaks. The kind that doesn't ask permission to arrive. The alignment between Mercury and Taurus is unfolding, not in the abstract way astrology is sometimes dismissed, but in a way that physically changes the air, thickens the silence, bends time ever so slightly. The official moment is marked for tomorrow, yet the frequency is already active, humming beneath skin and thought alike. There's a strange tension between idea and outcome, like reaching for a shape in fog that flickers just out of grasp. Has that ever happened? Where clarity seems close enough to taste, but the moment one acts, it slips into something else? It's not confusion exactly, more like a friction between vision and reality. Like a sketch being drawn with invisible ink, only visible in the right light. And now with this shift mid-breath, everything that was once certain feels elastic. Not wrong, just unstable. So then, is it better to wait for things to land or to move with them as they float? It's June 7th and something feels off, like being inside a house that hasn't quite decided whether it's asleep or awake. The transition hasn't fully happened, but its echo is already shaping the room. Technically, Mercury hasn't stepped into Taurus yet, but the ripples are already brushing against the walls. Odd, isn't it, how something that hasn't arrived can still be felt? For some, especially those more attuned to fixed rhythms and rooted presence, the sensation cuts a little deeper, like gravity shifting mid-stride. And yet signs don't matter much here. This atmosphere touches everyone differently, though not one of them remains untouched. Conversations are starting to sound like déjà vu. Random thoughts overlap with strangers' timelines. Are these coincidences, or has the invisible thread grown more tangled than usual? Anyone else noticed how strangely synchronized the confusion feels? One wonders, if thoughts are colliding in the same invisible hallway, who else is sitting in the dark with the same questions, silently tracing the same foggy outlines? What's coming next might just be the missing piece you didn't know you were looking for. Hit subscribe, because the next message wasn't meant to be missed. Some days arrive not with answers, but with pressure points. Today is one of them. Subtle at first, like a vibration underfoot, and then suddenly too loud to ignore. Moments arise designed to poke at the least armored parts of the psyche. Thoughts twist, emotions jump without warning. It isn't random. These aren't just fluctuations in mood, but carefully timed signals, echoes from the inner chamber that test whether anything has actually changed, or if the same scripts are still running under a different sky. The trap is reactivity, that quick flaring fire that wants to speak before listening, to strike before seeing. But here's the edge. Whatever reaction comes next will determine whether the terrain ahead expands or collapses into a loop. Fascinating, isn't it? How a moment of restraint can be more powerful than a year of effort. So what would happen if, just for today, thought wasn't allowed to chase instinct? If the inner pulse was met with stillness instead of response? Consider that carefully. What might shift if silence became the loudest answer in the room? Perhaps the number stamped on tomorrow isn't just a timestamp, but an intervention. Most have been moving fast enough that the destination blurred into motion itself. But this numerical gate, this 10 and 5, is a strange kind of mirror. Not to admire, but to confront. The 10 represents recursion, a circuit running in the background, replaying choices on loop, hiding its repetition behind the illusion of newness. It's the echo disguised as progression, the rhythm mistaken for evolution. Then comes 5, not as an addition, but a break, a hand on the lever, a spark in the routine. It's the raw interruption, a split-second clarity slicing through autopilot. What's fascinating is how these symbols play together. One drifts, one jolt. But when they meet, a pattern is exposed and a course correction becomes unavoidable. Isn't it strange how most wake-up calls arrive wrapped in disruption rather than comfort? If this is a correction, not a climax, then maybe the question isn't what's opening, but rather, what was drifting that now demands to be steered again? If you understood even part of this, it means the signal is reaching you. Subscribe. The rest will make sense soon enough. There's a strange texture to today's clarity. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or vision, but with a peculiar blend of hyper-awareness and surreal haze. Eyes blink more slowly, yet catch things normally missed. The pace of breath changes without conscious command. It's easy to mistake it for disorientation, but what's actually unfolding is something far less chaotic: the nervous system waking up after a long stretch of stillness. This threshold, call it a portal, call it a break in routine, shocks attention back into the present moment like a sudden floodlight in a forgotten room. Movements become visible. Patterns once buried beneath distraction begin flickering at the edges. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Observation isn't always peaceful. It can feel invasive. There's an exposure in seeing habits as they truly are, where a glance becomes a mirror and a pause becomes a reckoning. Ever notice how the act of witnessing one's own motion feels more vulnerable than standing still? That's not dysfunction. That's the machinery of self-recalibrating, slowly, awkwardly, but on purpose. As this cosmic alignment begins to take root, something within begins to stiffen, not in resistance, but in resolution. The internal dialogue, once prone to backtracking or apology, starts sounding less like negotiation and more like clarity. Not everyone will interpret that change gently. The shift isn't a glitch in personality, nor a lapse in empathy. It's a realignment, a sharpening of mental edges that once dulled themselves for the comfort of others. As the tempo decelerates, thoughts stop sprinting and start anchoring. The mind no longer rushes toward premature answers or distracts itself with looping options. Instead, it grows methodical, deliberate, grounded. What once felt like indecision is replaced with a kind of internal gravity, pulling attention toward things that truly hold weight. What does it mean when one no longer needs speed to validate direction? When stillness feels like movement in disguise? In this new mental atmosphere, truth doesn't arrive with flair. It emerges from quiet, focused persistence. And once found, it no longer needs to argue for its place. Has that kind of certainty ever crept in unnoticed? If you felt something here, like it was meant just for you, maybe it was. Subscribe. No need to explain it, just stay. Something unusual begins to settle in the mental field. Less a decision, more an instinctive refusal. Not in defiance, but in protection. For those accustomed to weighing every angle, absorbing every nuance, this newfound rigidity might feel alien, even abrupt. But it isn't emotional withdrawal, it's alignment. What's forming now is a psychological filter tuned not to preference, but precision. The kind of inner clarity that doesn't entertain commentary or compromise, not out of pride, but necessity. The mind begins gating its energy, reserving it for pathways that resonate rather than dilute. Of course, this change won't read well to everyone. Some might mislabel it as coldness or detachment. But what if it's neither? What if this is what mental sovereignty looks like when the signal sharpens and everything off frequency becomes unbearable noise? And here's the uncomfortable truth. Clarity often masquerades as distance, not because it isolates, but because it distinguishes. Has that boundary ever felt less like a wall and more like a tuning fork? What if this narrowing focus isn't closing the world out, but finally letting the true signal in? This is the spark that was predicted, the moment where pressure stops being theoretical and takes form. It might come as a sideways comment, an uncharacteristic silence, or a look that lands with more weight than intended. Something small and seemingly random triggers a disproportionate response, and suddenly attention is yanked into high alert. But this isn't chaos, it's choreography. The emotional current moving through the day isn't meant to injure, it's meant to expose. While the mind struggles to stabilize mid-transit, external friction increases, not as punishment, but as provocation. The world reflects back every unresolved fragment. People misfire, messages glitch, conversations carry sharp edges that weren't there yesterday. But this frequency isn't really about them, is it? It's a mirror held still long enough to reveal the reflex beneath the reaction. So then the real question emerges. When the spark hits, is it burned skin or buried flint that flares up first? Noticing the difference might be the entire point of today's test. And if it is, what happens when provocation is met not with fire, but with understanding? Still thinking about what you just heard? That's not an accident. Subscribe. Let what's waking up in you keep unfolding. Some moments arrive not to be solved, but to be left untouched. Today's tension disguises itself as urgency, demanding an answer, a defense, a reaction. But the true challenge lies in doing none of the above. The impulse to respond, to match frequency with frequency, is a well-worn groove in the nervous system. But when nothing is said, when stillness takes the place of sound, something deeper begins to unfold. The environment may roar, prod, unravel, but choosing not to echo that energy sends a signal far beyond the moment. It declares a refusal to merge with instability. The pattern breaks not through confrontation, but disengagement. And in that pause, brief as it may be, an invisible gate swings open. What would it mean to step back and watch the old script collapse under its own noise? To hold space not for the drama, but for what grows in its absence? If this really is the moment that resets the direction, maybe the only real act of power is choosing not to perform at all. Does silence ever feel louder than sound? Today it might. There's a new kind of hunger emerging, quiet, insistent, and oddly specific. It doesn't ask for distraction or entertainment, and it certainly won't be satisfied by surface-level stimulation. This craving runs deeper, like the body remembering a flavor it hasn't tasted in years. As the mental current stabilizes under this astrological influence, thoughts begin to lean away from abstraction and toward integration. It's not about knowing more, it's about knowing differently. Knowledge starts to feel less like information and more like food, something that should be digested, metabolized, lived. Suddenly, random obsessions arise: gardening, fermentation, lunar cycles, soil. And while it may appear out of nowhere, it's not random at all. The mind is reaching backward to find what once kept people connected, intact, and in rhythm with the earth. Notice that? How intellectual curiosity is starting to feel more like instinct than inspiration? That's not nostalgia, it's biological memory waking up. And maybe that's the real shift here. Knowledge no longer for display, but for survival, ritual, and return. What's been calling that hasn't had language until now? Curiosity is shifting shape. It no longer drifts through novelty, it digs. What may seem like irrelevant mental detours right now are actually coded signals from a deeper part of the psyche that's been quietly listening to what reason has been missing. The pull toward obscure topics, lost skills, forgotten tools. These aren't distractions, they're breadcrumbs. The soul has a strange way of choosing its next path, often long before the intellect understands where it leads. And here's where most get stuck: dismissing the urge because it doesn't fit the plan. But what if the plan was the distraction? What if the seemingly random research rabbit hole is where the real blueprint lives? This isn't about consuming content to pass time. It's about unearthing something tangible enough to hold, build, apply. That clarity everyone's been waiting for? It doesn't arrive like an answer. It grows like a root once it finds the right soil. So pause for a second. Has anything been calling from the edges of attention lately? Quiet but persistent? What happens if, this time, that pull is followed? Lately, conversations may begin to feel weightless, like words are being released into a vacuum, only to vanish before they land. Ideas once met with nods or emojis now hover in an odd, unacknowledged stillness. It's tempting to interpret that absence as distance or disinterest, but perhaps something subtler is at play. In this slowed terrain of thought and expression, language takes longer to travel. It doesn't bounce back immediately. Instead, it lingers, seeps, and slowly sinks beneath the surface. Communication here isn't transactional, it's transformational. It's less about what is said and more about what is being planted. And here's the nuance. Just because the soil goes quiet after the seed is placed doesn't mean nothing is happening. On the contrary, it may be the most fertile silence yet. Could it be that this pause is a form of reverence? That what's being shared requires digestion rather than reaction? In a world conditioned to validate through speed, what shifts when stillness becomes the measure of depth? The echoes will return, but not as noise. They'll come back and change behavior, in shifted perception, in truth that didn't exist before those words were spoken. There's a peculiar ache moving beneath the surface lately, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniably present. It can arrive in the quietest of moments. Watching a stranger water their plants in total presence, catching a glimpse of someone who seems completely unbothered by pace or noise. It isn't bitterness or rivalry, it's something far older, a form of yearning that emerges when the soul recognizes something it once knew, but no longer practices. This isn't envy in its usual costume. It's more like resonance, misinterpreted only because the body doesn't yet have language for it. And here's the twist. That sting of longing, that subtle pang while witnessing someone else's groundedness, is not about them at all. It's the internal compass clicking back toward alignment, pointing to a lifestyle, a rhythm, a state of being that has been quietly calling. Ever felt that strange combination of admiration and ache? That's not weakness. See, it's guidance. Those flashes of quiet jealousy, unexpected and raw, might just be the signal flare of a self that's ready to root deeper. What part of the spirit has been whispering for slower mornings, quieter choices, deeper roots? And what happens when that whisper is finally heard? Communication is slowing down, not from hesitation, but from necessity. As mental energy begins syncing with a more grounded rhythm, the nature of speech transforms. It stops serving as a tool for performance and becomes something more sensory, more instinctive. Words carry weight now. They don't just land, they linger, and in that lingering, they reveal texture. The body becomes the first interpreter, not the intellect. A sentence that once flowed out with ease might now leave a residue. Bitter, sharp, unnatural. And that shift, it's not rhetorical, it's biochemical. The throat tightens when words betray alignment. The chest softens when they're true. This isn't about diplomacy or eloquence. It's about integrity between thought, body, and voice. Ever notice how a lie, even a small one, changes posture? Or how the truth feels like a deep breath after being underwater too long? That's the cue. This isn't the week to speak on cue, to reply quickly, to fill space. It's a time to taste each word before releasing it. Not to impress, but to resonate. And perhaps the silence between words is what makes them land at all. There's a different kind of quiet rising now, not the silence of hesitation or uncertainty, but the kind that guards something valuable. In this space, expression is no longer automatic. Words begin to feel less like reactions and more like commitments, and the body knows the difference. There's a physical sensation when truth aligns, a soft grounding in the belly, a clarity in the jaw, a stillness before sound. Anything spoken without that alignment feels off, like trying to sculpt clay that hasn't been kneaded yet. Communication in this moment becomes less about being heard and more about being precise. The voice becomes an instrument of intention, not performance. And sometimes that means holding a truth back until it's fully ripened, until its shape matches its purpose. Has a sentence ever felt premature in the mouth, even if it sounded right in the mind? That's the signal. Wait, let the thoughts settle, change, deepen. Because when the right words finally arrive, they won't just inform, they'll build, they'll anchor. And the moment they land, it won't feel like speaking. It'll feel like remembering something the soul never forgot. The current mental terrain carries a certain weight, not in chaos or clutter, but in density. Thoughts no longer spin or sprint. Instead, they begin to compress, folding in on themselves as if something deeper is forming below the surface. It's a slowing that isn't quite stillness, a quiet that isn't quite peace. It's structure taking shape before it has a name. In this state, the usual craving for rapid insight begins to feel hollow. Answers don't rush in. They hover, just out of reach, waiting for the inner climate to settle enough to receive them. This isn't stagnation, it's preparation. The clarity being sought isn't flashy or immediate. It's the kind that becomes part of the body once it lands, and it won't land until the nervous system stops pacing. Ever notice how the most lasting truths never announce themselves with urgency? That's because real foundations aren't loud. They're deliberate. They don't rise up to meet pressure. They hold still until pressure dissolves. So if the mind feels heavier now, ask this: is it sinking or settling? Because what's being built may not be visible yet, but it's already beginning to hold weight. Something ancient stirs in this cycle, not through revelation, but through restraint. The mind, trained to pursue answers like prey, suddenly finds itself in unfamiliar territory. No maps, no flash of genius, just a sense that something is forming quietly beneath the surface. And the instinct is to speed it up, to decode it, to make it produce. But this isn't the kind of clarity that performs under pressure. It's the kind that matures in darkness, like clay setting beneath steady hands. This energy demands stillness, not as passivity, but as participation. To hold a thought without breaking it apart, to let it hum in the background without hijacking it with logic. There's discipline in allowing mystery to stretch itself out. That recurring idea, the one that won't go away, what if it isn't a problem? What if it's the blueprint of something trying to root itself in physical life? Thought becomes action not by force, but by embodiment. And embodiment takes time. Sculptors don't rush, neither does the earth. So here's the invitation. What if waiting isn't in the way? What if it is the way? In a world trained to prize rapid understanding, there's something disorienting, almost defiant about truth that takes its time. Insight isn't always thunderous. Often it arrives like sediment, layer by layer, until one day it's simply there, anchored, unmoving, undeniable. And that's the strange gift of this moment. Transformation not through epiphany, but through erosion. The surface thoughts begin to quiet, not because the mind has given up, but because something deeper has started to speak. Not with words, but with weight. This isn't clarity in the form of explanation. It's clarity in the form of becoming. No diagrams, no revelations. Just a quiet integration that reshapes posture, choice, tone. Ever look back and realize the answer had already arrived long before it had a name? That's the kind of truth being formed here. Not spoken, but lived. Not quick, but irreversible. And maybe the real turning point isn't when the thought appears, but when it no longer needs to. So here's the question to leave open. What if the silence isn't waiting for a thought, but waiting for the thought to become real in the way life is lived? Gratitude lingers in moments like this, not as a formality, but as a shared breath between speaker and listener. What was explored here wasn't just information. It was an invitation to feel, to question, to slow down in a culture built for speed. And if something in this space stirred the mind or softened a corner of the inner world, that alone is worth holding on to. Support isn't measured solely in numbers or clicks. It's felt in the quiet alignment between curiosity and presence. So if this journey resonated, if any part of it echoed in the deeper rooms of thought, let that be the seed. Responses are welcome. Reflections are welcome. Silence, too, is welcome. If continued exploration calls, returning here is always an option. Until the next passage unfolds, stay grounded, stay open, and let this space remain one of thoughtfulness in a world that often forgets how to think with care.